Please go home, Evelyn. The kids are overwhelmed tonight. That was the text my daughter-in-law sent me while I stood outside her front door on Christmas Eve holding a pecan pie that was still warm in my hands. I stared at the message through the falling snow, certain at first that I had misunderstood it. Through the frosted windows of the house, I could see the glow of Christmas lights reflecting off the dining room walls. I could hear laughter too. My grandson Liam's loud little laugh carried all the way to the porch where I stood alone in my wool coat, the same red coat my late husband Thomas had bought me 12 years earlier during a trip to Vermont. The front yard was lined with glowing candy cane lights, and Vanessa's expensive wreath hung proudly on the door like something out of a magazine. Everything looked beautiful, warm, perfect, except for me standing outside like a stranger. I tightened my grip on the pie carrier and knocked again, softer this time, hoping maybe Daniel hadn't heard me over the music inside. Nothing. No footsteps. No movement toward the door. Then my phone buzzed again. We already explained to the children that tonight would be immediate family only. Immediate family. I actually laughed under my breath when I read that part because I had spent 38 years raising Daniel in that very house. I was the one who stayed awake through every fever, every nightmare, every school project spread across the kitchen table at midnight. Thomas worked long hours running his contracting business, and I never complained because we were building something together. A family, a home, traditions that mattered. Every Christmas Eve for nearly 4 decades had happened in that house. My house. I made the cinnamon rolls from scratch every year. I wrapped every present under that tree. I sat through every badly played middle school trumpet recital and every awkward family prayer before dinner. But now I was apparently not immediate family anymore. Snow gathered slowly on the shoulders of my coat while I stood there staring at the windows. Vanessa walked past the dining room carrying a tray of wine glasses, her blonde hair perfectly curled, her green velvet dress fitting her like she'd stepped out of a holiday commercial. She glanced toward the front door for half a second before quickly looking away. She knew I was out there. Of course she did. That was the cruelest part. This wasn't an accident. It was planned. Deliberate. I stepped backward off the porch carefully because the stone steps had frozen over. That's when I noticed something sitting beside the garage. A black realtor lockbox. At first, I thought maybe one of Daniel's friends was a realtor visiting for the holiday. But then I saw fresh footprints leading toward the side entrance of the house, and a cold feeling settled into my stomach heavier than the December air. I looked back toward the dining room window just in time to see 2 strangers walking through the house, while Vanessa pointed toward the staircase with a smile on her face. My fingers slowly tightened around my purse. Because inside that purse, folded neatly in a long white envelope Thomas had hidden before he died, was the deed to the house they thought already belonged to them. I sat in my car for almost 20 minutes after leaving Daniel's driveway, watching the snow pile slowly against the windshield while the heat hummed weakly through the vents. The pecan pie rested untouched on the passenger seat beside me, and the smell of butter and cinnamon filled the car so heavily it almost made me sick. Across the street, colorful Christmas lights blinked cheerfully on neighboring houses while families gathered around dinner tables, opening gifts early and drinking hot chocolate by fireplaces. Everywhere I looked, people belonged somewhere. That was the strange thing about growing older. Nobody warns you how invisible you can become while still being alive. I drove home carefully through the icy Connecticut roads, gripping the steering wheel tighter than usual because my hands would not stop trembling. Not from anger. Not yet. Mostly from the awful realization that tonight had not been spontaneous. Vanessa had planned this weeks ago. Maybe longer. By the time I pulled into the driveway of my small condo across town, the snow had already covered the front steps in a soft white layer. I carried the pie inside without turning on the television or the Christmas music I usually played every year. The silence felt safer somehow. My condo smelled faintly like pine candles and old books, and for the first time all evening, I could finally breathe without feeling humiliated. I set the pie down on the kitchen counter beside the stack of unopened Christmas cards I had planned to bring for the grandchildren. Liam loved the little $20 bills I tucked inside every year, and Sophie always called me afterward to thank me because she was still young enough to mean it. At least I hoped she was. I removed my coat slowly and hung it near the door before finally taking the envelope out of my purse. The paper was slightly worn now from how many times I had unfolded it over the last 2 years. Thomas had given it to me 6 days before he died. I still remembered the way the hospital room smelled that afternoon, sterile and cold with a faint trace of peppermint lotion from the nurses. He looked weaker than I had ever seen him, but his voice remained steady. "Do not let anyone pressure you after I am gone," he told me quietly while adjusting his oxygen tube, "especially when it comes to the house." At the time, I thought he was simply worried about finances. Daniel had been struggling with money for years despite pretending otherwise. Vanessa spent like appearances were oxygen. New luxury SUVs every few years. Private schools for the children. Kitchen remodels that looked like magazine spreads. Thomas noticed everything, even when he stayed quiet about it. I opened the envelope carefully and spread the documents across my kitchen table beneath the yellow glow of the overhead light. There it was again in black ink, exactly as I remembered. The deed had been transferred entirely into my name 18 months before Thomas passed away. Daniel never knew. Vanessa certainly did not know. According to them, I was just the elderly mother slowly taking up too much space in their perfect family life. But legally, the house they were showing to strangers tonight still belonged to me. My phone suddenly lit up against the table. For one foolish second, my heart lifted, thinking it might be Daniel apologizing. Instead, it was a photograph Vanessa had posted online. The whole family sat around the dining room table, smiling beneath the chandelier Thomas installed himself 20 years ago. The caption read, "Grateful for cozy Christmas memories with the people who matter most." I stared at the words for a long time before quietly setting my phone face down beside the deed. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the glow from Daniel's dining room windows and heard Vanessa's careful voice explaining to strangers how open and spacious the house felt. Around 3 in the morning, I finally gave up trying to sleep and walked into the kitchen wearing my old gray robe and wool socks. Snow still covered the balcony outside my condo, and the streetlights cast long pale reflections across the parking lot below. I made chamomile tea the same way Thomas liked it, with a little honey and too much steam rising from the mug. For years I believed routines could hold a family together. Sunday dinners, birthday calls, matching stockings hanging over the fireplace every Christmas morning. I used to think if I loved people consistently enough, they would eventually return that love with the same care. Age teaches you otherwise. By sunrise, I had convinced myself not to cry anymore over what happened. Crying would only make me feel smaller, and I had already spent too much of the last few years shrinking myself to make Vanessa comfortable. The truth was, this did not begin on Christmas Eve. That night was only the final step in a long, quiet process of removing me from my own family piece by piece. I remembered the first time I noticed something changing. It was 3 years earlier during Sophie's ballet recital. I arrived early carrying flowers and a small silver bracelet I had bought her from a jewelry store downtown. Vanessa smiled politely when she saw me standing near the auditorium entrance, but there was tension around her mouth. "Oh, Evelyn," she said sweetly. "I thought Daniel told you this was just immediate family seating near the stage." Immediate family. Even then she used those words carefully, like she was testing how much rejection I would tolerate before speaking up. I ended up sitting in the back row alone, while Vanessa's sister occupied the seat beside Daniel near the front. Later that same year, Vanessa changed Thanksgiving dinner from my home to theirs because she said it was easier for the children. Then Christmas brunch disappeared. Then summer weekends at the lake stopped. Slowly, every tradition that connected me to my son was redesigned until I became little more than an occasional guest invited out of obligation. Daniel always looked uncomfortable during those moments, but never uncomfortable enough to stop her. That was what hurt most. Not Vanessa's manipulation. I understood people like her. She valued appearances, control, status. But Daniel was my son. The boy who once cried for an hour when our golden retriever died because he could not bear losing something he loved. Somewhere along the way, he learned how to look directly at my loneliness and call it practicality. Around 9 that morning, my phone rang while I was folding blankets in the living room. The caller ID displayed the name Richard Lawson, Thomas's attorney. My stomach tightened immediately because Richard almost never called unexpectedly. "Evelyn," he said gently after I answered, "I apologize for contacting you on Christmas morning, but I believe you should know something." I sat down slowly on the edge of the couch. Outside, snow drifted softly against the windows while children somewhere nearby laughed in the hallway of the building. Richard cleared his throat carefully before continuing. Daniel and Vanessa contacted a real estate office 2 weeks ago. They have been attempting to begin a private sale process on the house. For a moment, I said nothing at all. Not because I was shocked anymore. Somehow, deep down, I already knew. Richard's voice lowered slightly. The realtor contacted my office late last night after discovering inconsistencies in the ownership records. Evelyn, they genuinely believe the property belonged to them already. I looked toward the kitchen table, where the deed still rested beneath the lamp exactly where I left it. Then for the first time since standing outside that locked front door, I felt something stronger than humiliation settle quietly inside me. Control. The day after Christmas, the snow finally stopped falling, leaving the entire neighborhood buried beneath a thick white silence that made everything feel strangely peaceful from the outside. I spent most of the morning sitting near my living room window with a blanket over my knees, watching a maintenance worker shovel the sidewalks below my condo building while soft sunlight reflected against the frozen parking lot. My phone remained unusually quiet. No apology from Daniel. No forced holiday greeting from Vanessa pretending nothing had happened. Part of me expected silence because that had become their preferred method whenever they did something cruel. Ignore it long enough, and eventually the other person feels foolish for being hurt at all. Around noon, Richard Lawson arrived carrying a leather briefcase and a cardboard tray with 2 coffees balanced carefully in his hands. He had been Thomas's attorney for over 20 years, but more than that, he had been his closest friend since college. Richard still wore the same navy wool overcoat he always wore during winters, and his silver hair was damp from melted snow when I opened the door. "You look tired," he said gently while stepping inside. I almost laughed at that because tired felt too small a word for what the last 24 hours had done to me. We sat at the kitchen table where the deed and property documents were already spread neatly beside my reading glasses. Richard removed several additional papers from his briefcase before adjusting them carefully into organized stacks. "I reviewed everything again this morning," he explained. "There is absolutely no legal confusion here. Thomas transferred complete ownership to you 18 months before his death. Daniel has no claim unless you choose to give him one." Hearing it stated so clearly changed something inside me. For months after Thomas died, I convinced myself that maybe I was becoming overly sensitive. Maybe Vanessa was simply stressed raising children. Maybe Daniel was overwhelmed with work and responsibilities. Older women are taught to excuse disrespect because we are afraid of appearing bitter. But sitting there at my kitchen table with legal proof in front of me, I finally understood this was never misunderstanding. It was entitlement. Richard hesitated before speaking again. "There is something else you should know." I looked up immediately. The realtor informed me that Vanessa requested a private showing during Christmas Eve dinner. She specifically asked for discretion because she did not want family complications interfering with the sale. Family complications. I stared down at my coffee cup while anger slowly rose through me like heat under frozen ground. Not loud anger. Not explosive anger. The quieter kind that settles deeply into your bones and changes how you see people forever. Richard carefully slid another document across the table toward me. This was drafted by Thomas shortly before he passed away. He instructed me to give it to you only if circumstances became difficult with Daniel. My fingers tightened slightly as I unfolded the letter. The handwriting was unmistakably Thomas's, steady and careful despite the illness that had weakened him so badly near the end. "Evelyn," the letter began. "If you are reading this, then I was right to worry." I had to stop for a moment because hearing his voice through those words nearly broke me. Richard remained silent while I continued reading. Thomas explained that over the last few years he noticed Vanessa pressuring Daniel constantly about money, inheritance, and the future value of the property. He wrote that Daniel loved me, but lacked the strength to challenge his wife once she decided something benefited their image or lifestyle. Then came the sentence that made my chest tighten painfully. "You spent your entire life building that home with me. Never allow anyone to convince you that you became unnecessary inside it." I lowered the letter slowly onto the table while tears burned behind my eyes for the first time since Christmas Eve. Not because I felt weak anymore, but because Thomas had seen all of this coming long before I did. 3 days passed before Daniel finally called me. By then, most of the Christmas decorations around town had already started disappearing. Wreaths came down from front doors. Artificial trees appeared beside garbage bins waiting for pickup. The holiday that once brought my family together now felt like something sharp I could not quite remove from my chest. I was standing in my kitchen washing coffee cups when my phone began vibrating across the counter. Daniel's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment I simply stared at it while water continued running over my hands. Part of me still wanted him to sound like my son again. I hated that part of myself. I dried my hands slowly before answering. "Hello, Daniel." There was a pause on the other end before he spoke. "Mom, I think there has been some kind of misunderstanding." Of course, that was his first sentence. Not an apology. Not concern. A misunderstanding. I leaned lightly against the counter while looking out at the snow melting along the edge of the parking lot below my condo. "Has there?" I asked quietly. Daniel exhaled heavily like a man already exhausted by consequences he did not expect to face. "Vanessa told me Richard contacted the realtor directly and caused a problem with the listing." Listing. The word sounded almost absurd coming from him, like he still believed we were discussing paperwork instead of betrayal. "The realtor was informed of the truth," I replied calmly. "The truth," he repeated with frustration creeping into his voice. "Mom, we were trying to make plans for the future. That house is too large for one person anyway." I closed my eyes briefly because suddenly I could hear Thomas laughing softly somewhere deep in my memory. Not cruel laughter. Just the tired amusement of a man who always understood people more clearly than I did. "Interesting," I said, especially considering I was apparently not important enough to enter the house on Christmas Eve. Silence answered me for several seconds. Then Daniel lowered his voice. "Vanessa thought it would be less stressful for the children." That sentence settled something permanently inside me. Not because it was cruel, but because it was cowardly. Daniel had become the kind of man who hid behind his wife's decisions whenever morality became inconvenient. I remembered him at 10 years old standing between two boys fighting on a playground because he hated unfairness. Somewhere along the way, comfort mattered more to him than character. "The children saw strangers touring the house while I stood outside in the snow," I said quietly. "Would you like to explain that part too?" His breathing changed instantly. "Mom, nobody was trying to hurt you." There it was again. That careful rewriting of reality people use when they know they are wrong, but still want to feel like good people afterward. I walked slowly toward the living room while holding the phone against my ear. The late afternoon sunlight stretched across the carpet in pale gold lines, and for the first time in years, I did not feel intimidated by my own son. "Daniel," I said softly, "did you honestly believe your father left that house to you?" Another silence followed, longer this time. Then he spoke carefully. "Dad always said it would stay in the family." I almost smiled at that because Thomas had indeed kept his promise. The problem was Daniel no longer understood who his family truly was. "Your father transferred the deed before he died," I explained. "Legally, the property belongs entirely to me." Daniel inhaled sharply like the air had suddenly disappeared from the room around him. In the background, I could faintly hear Vanessa asking him something in a tense whisper. He moved the phone away briefly before returning. "Mom," he said slowly, "Vanessa did not know that." I sat down carefully in my armchair beside the window where soft evening snow had begun falling again. "No," I answered. "She did not. But she seemed very comfortable selling a home that did not belong to her anyway." For the first time since the conversation began, Daniel sounded genuinely shaken. Not heartbroken. Not ashamed. Afraid. The next morning, Vanessa called me herself. That alone told me how serious the situation had become, because for years she avoided direct conversations whenever possible. She preferred carefully worded group texts, polite smiles at family dinners, and having Daniel speak on her behalf whenever conflict appeared. I was sitting at my dining table eating oatmeal when her name flashed across my phone screen. Outside, the snow had finally begun melting from the rooftops, leaving long trails of water sliding down gutters beneath the pale winter sun. I let the phone ring twice before answering. "Good morning, Vanessa." Her voice arrived overly soft, the way people speak when they're trying to sound calm, while panic quietly builds underneath every word. "Evelyn, I think we really need to clear up some misunderstandings before this situation becomes embarrassing for everyone." I nearly smiled into my coffee cup. Embarrassing for everyone. Not painful. Not cruel. Embarrassing. Vanessa cared about appearances the way other people cared about oxygen. "I am not confused about the situation," I replied evenly. "I was locked out of Christmas dinner while you showed my house to buyers." She inhaled sharply before speaking again. The children did not need tension during the holidays. There it was again. Everything always reduced to convenience and image. I looked around my quiet condo at the framed family photographs still sitting on the shelves. In every picture, I was standing slightly off to the side, while Vanessa remained perfectly centered beside Daniel. Somehow I had never noticed that before. "How long were you planning to hide the sale from me?" I asked. Silence stretched for several seconds. Then Vanessa shifted tactics entirely. "Evelyn, that house is too much responsibility at your age. Daniel and I were trying to help everyone move forward." Help everyone. Such a polished phrase for something so cold. I remembered all the little comments she had made over the years disguised as concern. Maybe the stairs were becoming dangerous for me. Maybe I should simplify my life. Maybe retirement communities offered more social activities for seniors. None of it sounded cruel individually. That was Vanessa's talent. She built exclusion slowly enough that nobody noticed until they were already outside the door. "Your husband understood the arrangement," she continued carefully. "Thomas always intended for the property to stay with Daniel eventually." This time I did smile, though she could not see it. "Thomas intended for me to be protected," I said quietly. "There is a difference." Her voice hardened slightly for the first time. "Legally, maybe. But emotionally, this is still Daniel's family home." Family home. The words echoed strangely through me because suddenly I realized Vanessa had never understood why the house mattered. To her, it was square footage, school districts, resale value, social standing. But to me, it was 38 years of birthdays, grief, prayers whispered beside sick children, handwritten growth marks penciled onto laundry room walls, and Christmas mornings when Thomas danced badly in flannel pajamas while cooking bacon for everyone. You cannot inherit memories simply because you move furniture into the rooms where they happened. "No," I answered softly. "It was my family home long before you arrived." Another silence followed. In the background, I could hear cabinet doors closing quickly and faint tension in Daniel's voice somewhere farther away inside the house. Then Vanessa lowered her voice almost to a whisper. "What exactly are you planning to do?" I looked down at Thomas's letter still resting beside my coffee mug. For the first time in years, I did not feel pressured to soften my honesty just to keep peace inside the family. "I have not decided yet," I told her calmly. "But I know one thing for certain." She waited quietly. People who treat someone like they are already gone should not act surprised when that person finally stops protecting them. After I hung up, I sat very still for several moments while sunlight moved slowly across the table. Then I reached for my phone again and called Richard Lawson. "I am ready," I said quietly when he answered. Richard arrived at my condo the following afternoon carrying a thick folder of documents and the same calm expression he always wore inside courtrooms and hospital waiting rooms. Outside, the sky hung low and gray over the city, and freezing rain tapped softly against the windows while traffic moved slowly through slushy streets below. I had spent the morning cleaning my kitchen even though nobody was coming except him. Old habits are difficult to break. Women like me are taught to prepare homes for people who no longer appreciate the effort. Richard removed his coat carefully and laid the folder across my dining table beside the untouched Christmas cards I still had not mailed. "Once this is filed," he explained gently, "Daniel and Vanessa will receive formal notice that any attempted sale or refinance of the property is unauthorized without your direct consent." I nodded quietly while reading through the papers. The language was cold and official, but underneath every sentence rested something deeply personal. Boundaries, ownership, consequences. For years I had avoided those things because mothers are expected to absorb discomfort silently in order to preserve peace inside families. But peace built entirely on one person shrinking themselves is not peace at all. "There is another issue," Richard continued carefully. "Property taxes and homeowner insurance have still been coming from your accounts since Thomas passed away." I looked up immediately. "Excuse me." Richard adjusted his glasses before sliding additional statements toward me. "Daniel switched most utilities into his name last year, but the taxes, insurance policy, and maintenance reserve account remained connected to yours. Legally speaking, you have been financially supporting the property this entire time." For several moments, I simply stared at the paperwork while a strange numbness spread through my chest. It was not even the money that hurt most. Thomas and I had always been careful financially. We had enough. What hurt was realizing Daniel knew exactly how dependent they still were on me, while simultaneously treating me like an inconvenience they could eventually phase out. Richard watched my expression carefully. "I am sorry, Evelyn." I folded the statements slowly into a neat stack before answering. "No," I said quietly. "I think I needed to see this." That evening, after Richard left, I sat alone in my living room listening to freezing rain hit the balcony railings while the condo filled with soft yellow lamplight. Around 7:30, my phone began vibrating repeatedly against the coffee table. Daniel, then Vanessa, then Daniel again. I let every call go to voicemail. The next message arrived by text instead. "Mom, please call us. This has gone too far. Gone too far." I looked around my quiet condo at the bookshelves, knitted blankets, and framed photographs from a life I had spent decades building with Thomas. Strange how people only accuse you of causing division once you finally stop accepting mistreatment quietly. Another message appeared moments later, this one from Vanessa. "The children are upset and confused. Sophie has been crying all evening." That one almost worked because Vanessa understood exactly where my weak spots lived. She always had. But then I remembered standing outside that locked front door while my grandchildren laughed inside without me. I remembered the realtor lockbox beside the garage. I remembered Vanessa calling me emotionally unnecessary while still expecting me to financially protect the life she wanted. My hands no longer trembled when I picked up the phone. Calmly, I opened my banking application and canceled the automatic property tax withdrawal connected to the house. Then I contacted the insurance company and requested immediate review of all active policies tied to the property ownership records. Finally, I forwarded Richard's legal notice directly to Daniel's email. I did not write anything else beneath it. No anger, no threats, no dramatic speeches, just paperwork. About 20 minutes later, my phone rang again. This time when I answered, I could hear genuine panic in Daniel's voice for the very first time in my life. Daniel arrived at my condo just after 8 the next morning, while freezing rain still coated the sidewalks outside in thin sheets of ice. I saw his black SUV pull into the parking lot from my living room window before he even knocked on the door. For a few seconds, he remained sitting behind the steering wheel with both hands pressed against his forehead, like a man trying desperately to hold his life together. Then he stepped out into the cold wearing the same charcoal overcoat Thomas bought him years earlier for a business promotion dinner. Seeing him dressed in his father's coat almost hurt more than anything else. When I opened the door, Daniel looked exhausted. Not physically exhausted, morally exhausted. The kind of exhaustion people carry when they have spent too long pretending not to notice who they are becoming. "Mom," he said quietly, "can I come in?" I stepped aside without answering. The condo smelled faintly of coffee and cinnamon candles, and soft jazz music played low from the kitchen radio. Daniel looked around the room awkwardly like he had never truly seen where I lived before. Maybe he had not. People rarely notice places they assume they will never need. He sat at my dining table while I poured coffee into one of the old ceramic mugs Thomas and I bought during our 20th anniversary trip to Maine. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Rain tapped steadily against the windows while distant traffic hissed through wet streets below. Finally, Daniel exhaled heavily. "Vanessa is terrified," he admitted. I stirred cream slowly into my coffee without looking up. "Interesting," I said calmly. "I was terrified too, standing outside your front door on Christmas Eve." His face tightened immediately. "Mom, I know it looked terrible." I raised my eyes toward him then. "It did not look terrible, Daniel. It was terrible." Silence filled the room again. My son looked suddenly older sitting there beneath the soft kitchen light. Lines of stress cut deeply around his mouth now, and there were faint shadows beneath his eyes I had never noticed before. Marriage changes people. Sometimes slowly enough that mothers keep hoping the child underneath will return if they remain patient long enough. "Vanessa thought we were making practical decisions," he said carefully. "The market is strong right now. We thought downsizing would eventually make sense for you." Downsizing. Another polished word people use when they want to remove someone from the center of their own life. I folded my hands quietly on the table. Did it also make sense to erase me from Christmas dinner before discussing any of it? Daniel opened his mouth, but nothing came out immediately. That answer alone told me everything. Finally, he looked down toward his coffee cup. I should have stopped it. Those 6 words hurt more than excuses would have. Because they were honest. He should have stopped it. Years ago. before the family traditions disappeared, before Vanessa slowly repositioned me from mother to burden, before my own son learned to measure my value according to convenience. Then Daniel spoke again, softer this time. Sophia heard us arguing last night. I looked up immediately at my granddaughter's name. She asked Vanessa if Grandma Evelyn was going away forever. His voice cracked slightly on the last word. And Vanessa told her not to worry because eventually old people need to make room for younger families. The room became very still around us. Outside, freezing rain continued sliding silently down the windows while my chest tightened so sharply I could barely breathe for a moment. Daniel rubbed both hands over his face before whispering something that finally sounded like shame. Sophia started crying because she thought you were dying. I closed my eyes briefly because suddenly I understood why Thomas protected me legally before he died. It was never about money alone. He knew that once people stopped seeing you as fully human, they began discussing your disappearance like simple household planning. When I opened my eyes again, Daniel looked completely broken sitting across from me. But for the first time in many years, I no longer felt responsible for fixing him. By early spring, the house was no longer on the market. The realtor listing disappeared quietly within a week after Richard filed the ownership protections, and after that, nobody in Daniel's neighborhood mentioned the situation out loud anymore. People in wealthy Connecticut suburbs survive on silence almost as much as they survive on appearances. I heard through Richard that Vanessa blamed legal confusion whenever friends asked why the sale collapsed so suddenly. But the truth had already started spreading in quieter ways. School parents noticed tension. Church friends noticed Daniel attending Sunday service alone some mornings. Even the children noticed the difference because children always feel emotional weather before adults admit storms exist. I did not rush revenge the way movies teach people to do. Real heartbreak moves slower than that. Over the following months, I simply stopped rescuing everyone from the consequences of their own choices. Daniel and Vanessa suddenly had to manage the full cost of the lifestyle they spent years building while assuming I would silently support the foundation underneath it. The house taxes increased in April. The insurance premiums rose again during summer renewal. Their refinancing attempts stalled completely without my authorization attached to the deed. Little by little, the pressure they once hid behind polished smiles became visible. Daniel called occasionally during those months, but the conversations changed. He no longer sounded defensive. Mostly he sounded tired. Older somehow. One afternoon in July, he admitted Vanessa had moved into a short-term rental after weeks of constant arguments. She says I embarrassed her. He confessed quietly over the phone. I sat on my balcony watching rain clouds gather above the trees while listening to the sadness in my son's voice. No, I answered gently. The truth embarrassed her. There is a difference. He did not argue with me this time. That autumn, Sophia started visiting my condo twice a month on Saturdays. At first, Daniel stayed during the visits, hovering nervously like someone afraid fragile things might break if left unattended. But eventually he stopped worrying. Sophia and I baked cookies together, played card games, and planted herbs in little ceramic pots along the balcony railing. One afternoon while we were decorating cupcakes, she suddenly looked up at me and asked, "Grandma Evelyn, are old people really supposed to disappear when younger families need space?" For a moment, I could not speak. Children repeat truths adults try hardest to hide. I carefully set down the frosting knife before answering her. "No, sweetheart," I said softly. "People do not lose their place in a family just because they grow older." She seemed relieved hearing that. Then she wrapped both arms around me with the uncomplicated love children still know how to give before adulthood teaches conditions. By the time Christmas arrived again, my life looked very different than it had the year before. I no longer spent holidays waiting for invitations designed mostly out of guilt. Instead, I volunteered at a small community Christmas dinner hosted by my church for widows and elderly neighbors spending the holiday alone. The fellowship hall smelled like roasted turkey, coffee, pine candles, and cinnamon rolls cooling beside folding tables covered in red tablecloths. Laughter filled the room all evening. Real laughter, not the strained kind people perform for photographs. Near the end of the night, I stepped outside into the cold December air holding a paper cup of hot cider while soft snow drifted beneath the streetlights. My phone buzzed gently inside my coat pocket. It was a photograph from Daniel. Sophia stood beside the Christmas tree wearing the knitted scarf I made her, smiling proudly while holding a tray of cookies. Beneath the picture was a simple message. I finally understand what Dad was trying to protect. I stared at the screen for several seconds before slipping the phone back into my pocket. Then I looked up at the falling snow and realized something unexpected. The night they locked me outside that house was not the night I lost my family. It was the night I finally stopped begging people to remember my worth.